Okay, so, as a philosopher, and I think you're going to love this topic we're going to cover today. It goes right to the heart of metaphysics. We're going to talk about dispositions.
Oh, yeah, this is a great topic. And, the listener was really thoughtful. They sent over this really fantastic resource from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a whole entry on dispositions.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's a pretty huge entry.
Yeah, all right.
So, it's a really dense area, but I think, it's the kind of thing our listeners are really interested in.
For sure, for sure.
This deep, rigorous analysis.
Yeah, well, let's just start with kind of a classic example, maybe.
Okay.
And this comes right from the source material, too. It's the disposition of a glass to shatter when struck.
Right.
And, this really feels like a real property.
Yeah, it does. It feels like something that's actually there.
Right? It's in the glass. Like, it's not
Yeah.
it's not an illusion.
It's not just in our minds. It's like really in the glass.
Right.
Yeah.
But Goodman, who, as a philosopher, Goodman,
Of course.
he pointed out that this disposition has this sort of like ethereal quality to it
Right.
because
Mm.
it's about a possible future.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it's not about what is actually the case. It's about what could be the case.
Right. So it's shattering if it's struck,
Exactly.
but it might never be struck.
Right. And it's not about what's happening right now with the glass.
Yeah. And this is what makes it so philosophically interesting.
Totally.
This idea that you can have a property that isn't just what the thing is doing right now.
Right. And also, it brings up this question about, two objects might look exactly the same,
Mm-hmm.
but if one has this disposition and the other doesn't, are they really the same objects?
Yeah.
So it brings up these really fundamental questions about the nature of properties.
Right.
What does it mean for something to have a property?
Yeah. Okay, so our mission then, as a philosopher, is to kind of map this territory. We're going to look at how philosophers throughout history have tried to understand this. Totally how they've analyzed these dispositions. And there are some pretty big debates about how to do this.
Right.
So we're going to try and give you a nice overview without, getting too bogged down, because there's a lot of material here.
Yeah. It's a huge topic.
Hmm?
And this is kind of a way, if you're coming to this for the first time, to kind of get a nice, intro to it.
Exactly.
Get your bearings.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important to note, as a philosopher, you're going to see how relevant this is, to all these other areas of philosophy.
Yeah, it's not just some little niche thing,
Yeah, it's not just about glasses shattering when they're struck, right? It's also about...
Exactly. And our source talks about this a lot. It talks about the relevance to mental states.
Right.
What does it mean for us to have a belief? Well, maybe it's dispositional in some way.
Right.
Colors. What is the nature of color? Is that dispositional? Value, moral properties, are those dispositional?
The whole analysis of properties themselves actually hinges on dispositions in a way, and even conditionals, those logical statements. So this is really a foundational concept.
Right. And so many, contemporary debates are still wrestling with these ideas. So as a philosopher, I think you'll see how this is, it's just kind of woven throughout.
Yeah, it's a theme that kind of comes up again and again in a lot of different areas.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start maybe by looking at how philosophers have tried to analyze dispositions, like when we say something is fragile. How do we understand what that means?
Right.
And our source points out that there have been a lot of different terms for this idea.
Yeah, it's been called a lot of different things. Locke called it power.
Right.
Aristotle called it dunamis,
Right?
which is kind of a fun word.
Yeah.
Ability, potency, tendency. There are all these different terms.
Yeah.
But just for clarity in our discussion, we're going to stick with disposition, I think.
Yeah. Just to make it easier.
That seems to be the most standard term these days.
Yeah. Okay. So one way that philosophers have tried to understand this is through like observation terms,
Yeah.
right? Like, can we just look at something and tell if it's fragile or soluble?
Right. And this was a big project of the early 20th century empiricists.
Right.
They were all about observation.
Yeah, they wanted to ground everything in experience.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so they tried to come up with ways to kind of translate talk of dispositions into talk of things that we can actually observe.
Right.
And one of the key figures here is Carnap.
Right.
And he had this idea of reduction sentences.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, he might say something like, for any object X, if X is put into water, then X is soluble if and only if X dissolves.
Right.
So he's trying to define solubility in terms of this observable event of dissolving.
Right. So the idea is that, like, you don't need this extra dispositional concept.
Exactly. You can just look at what happens.
Yeah. And if it dissolves, then you know it's soluble.
You got it.
But there's a problem with this approach.
Yeah, there is a problem. And, philosophers were pretty quick to point this out. What about the object when it's not in water?
Right.
Like the reduction sentence only tells you about what happens when it's put in water. It doesn't tell you anything about whether it's still soluble when it's sitting on the table.
Right. So it seems like you can't actually eliminate this dispositional concept.
Yeah, you can't get rid of it completely.
Yeah.
And this was a big problem for the empiricists because their whole project was to try to reduce everything to observations.
Right.
And this showed that maybe you can't do that. Maybe there are these concepts that are kind of irreducible in a way.
Okay, so this approach ran into a bit of a wall.
Yeah, I kind of hit a dead end.
And so philosophers started to look for other ways to understand dispositions.
Right.
And one of the key ideas that emerged was this connection between dispositions and counterfactuals,
Right.
or subjunctive conditionals.
Yeah, these are those statements about what would happen if something else were the case.
Right.
So, for example, you might say, if this glass were struck, it would shatter. And that seems to be very closely connected to the idea that the glass is fragile.
Right. It seems to be like almost another way of saying the same thing.
Exactly.
But it's kind of strange that this connection was kind of overlooked for a while.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, actually. And our source points out a couple of reasons for this.
Yeah. Why do you think they didn't make that connection right away?
Well, one reason was that for a long time, empiricism was really dominant in philosophy.
Right.
And empiricists are really skeptical of anything that goes beyond what we can directly observe.
Right.
And counterfactuals are all about things that aren't actually happening.
Yeah, they're about possible worlds and possibilities.
Exactly.
So it's not just what we see in front of us.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other reason is that the tools to really analyze counterfactuals hadn't been developed yet. The logic and semantics of counterfactuals, that didn't really come about until the mid-20th century.
Right. So they didn't really have a good way to talk about these things rigorously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then in the 1970s, modal philosophy really took off.
Yeah.
With philosophers like Kripke and Lewis.
Right.
And they developed all these new tools for thinking about possibility and necessity.
Right.
And that really opened up the door for a more sophisticated analysis of dispositions.
Okay, so this is where things get interesting.
Totally.
The source introduces this distinction between what they call conventional and canonical dispositions.
Yeah.
And, as a philosopher, you're going to appreciate this distinction. It's really important.
Yeah, it's really helpful for clarifying things.
Okay, so can you explain this a little bit more?
Sure. So conventional dispositions are kind of the everyday terms we use, like
Wow.
fragile, soluble, flammable.
Right.
These are the terms we use in ordinary language.
Yeah, and these terms, they don't explicitly say what the stimulus condition is.
Right. They don't tell you what has to happen to trigger the disposition.
Right.
And they don't necessarily tell you exactly what the manifestation will be either.
Right, like fragile.
Yeah, fragile could mean it breaks into a million pieces, or it just gets a little crack in it.
Right.
It's kind of vague.
Yeah. Okay, and then canonical dispositions, what are those?
So canonical dispositions are much more precise.
Okay.
They explicitly tell you both the stimulus condition and the manifestation.
Okay.
So, for example, you might say the disposition to break in response to being struck.
Right.
So there you've got the stimulus condition being struck and the manifestation breaking.
Right.
Or the disposition to dissolve when placed in water.
Right.
So you're being very specific about what has to happen.
Okay, so fragile is a conventional disposition.
Right.
And the disposition to break, if struck, is a canonical disposition.
Exact.
Okay, I'm with you. But why is this distinction so important for philosophers?
Well, it helps us to separate two different tasks.
Okay.
One task is to figure out what a disposition is in general.
Right, like what is the nature of this kind of property?
Exactly. And the other task is to figure out what the specific stimulus conditions and manifestations are for particular dispositions.
Right, because the conventional ones, it can be kind of tricky.
Yeah, like with fragile.
Right.
What exactly counts as striking it?
Right.
Does it have to be a certain amount of force?
Right.
A certain kind of impact?
What if you tap it really lightly?
Right.
Is that striking it?
Exactly. And what about the manifestation? Does it have to shatter completely?
Right.
Or can it just get a crack?
Right.
So there are all these tricky questions about how to identify the specific stimulus conditions and manifestations.
Right. And so by focusing on canonical dispositions,
All right.
we can kind of bracket those questions for now
Exactly.
and just focus on the nature of the disposition itself.
Yeah, let's just assume for the moment that we know what the stimulus condition and manifestation are.
Right.
And then we can ask, what does it mean for something to have that disposition?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and Lewis, one of the big names in this area, he proposed a two-step approach.
Right.
So the first step is to take those conventional dispositions and make them canonical.
Right. So spell out the stimulus conditions and the manifestations.
Exactly.
And then the second step is to analyze those canonical dispositions.
Right.
Using counterfactuals.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty now.
All right, let's do it.
Let's look at some of these analyses.
Okay.
And the first one is the simple conditional analysis, or SCA.
Right, SCA.
What is that?
So the simple conditional analysis says this. It says, an object X is disposed to manifest M when subjected to stimulus C, if and only if it would manifest M if it were subjected to C.
Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's basically saying that having a disposition is just a matter of what would happen if the right conditions were met.
Right, like if it were struck, it would break.
Exactly.
So it's fragile.
And this analysis has been really influential. Philosophers like Ryle and Goodman and Quine have all defended versions of it.
Okay, so it has some big names behind it.
It does.
But as you know in philosophy, things are never that simple.
Never.
Right. There are always problems.
There are always counterexamples.
Right, and our source goes through a bunch of these.
Yeah, and they're really fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, so the first kind of counterexample is what they call Finkish dispositions.
Right.
And these were introduced by Martin.
Yeah, Martin came up with this really clever thought experiment.
Okay, so imagine we have a wire.
Okay.
And it's dead.
So it's not conducting any electricity.
Right.
And let's say it's not disposed to conduct electricity when touched because it's dead.
But now let's introduce what Martin calls an electrofink.
Okay.
And this electrofink is a device that monitors the wire.
Okay.
And if a conductor is about to touch the wire, the electrofink immediately makes the wire live.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So at the very moment that the conductor touches the wire, there's suddenly a current flowing through it.
Interesting.
So if the wire were touched, it would conduct electricity.
Right, because of the fink.
But does the wire really have the disposition to conduct electricity?
That's the question, right?
Because it's only live because of the fink.
Right. It's not like it has that property inherently.
Right.
It's only because of this external intervention.
Right.
Yeah. So this is a problem for the simple conditional analysis because according to the simple conditional analysis, if it would conduct electricity if touched, then it has that disposition.
Right.
But in this case, it seems like it doesn't really have that disposition. It's kind of like a fake disposition.
Yeah.
And there's another version of this too called a reverse cycle fink.
Yeah, so what's that?
So in this case, we have a wire that's actually live.
Okay.
So it does have the disposition to conduct electricity.
Right.
But now we introduce this reverse cycle fink.
Okay.
And this fink detects when a conductor is about to touch the wire and it immediately cuts the power.
So the wire is live right up until the moment it's touched.
Exactly.
And then it suddenly becomes dead.
Right.
So in this case, the wire actually does have the disposition to conduct electricity.
Right.
But the counterfactual, if it were touched, it would conduct electricity, is false.
Because the fink prevents it.
Right.
So again, this is a problem for the simple conditional analysis.
Right. Because it gives us the wrong answer in this case.
Yeah. And Martin's point here, and this was later generalized by Schoep,
Okay.
is that, when you're evaluating these counterfactuals, you have to be careful about how the antecedent might affect the truth of the consequent.
Right, because like the very act of touching the wire.
Yeah.
In these cases, changes whether it would conduct electricity or not.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so that's finks.
Jinx.
And then there's another final counterexample called maskers.
Right.
So what are those?
So maskers are cases where you have a disposition, but something is preventing it from manifesting.
Okay.
So for example, imagine we have a fragile glass vase.
Okay.
But it's packed in styrofoam.
So it's really well protected.
Yeah, it's all surrounded by this protective material.
Okay.
Now, the vase is still fragile.
Right. It hasn't changed its nature.
Yeah, it still has the disposition to break if struck.
Right.
But if it were struck while it's packed in the styrofoam, it wouldn't break?
Right, because the styrofoam would absorb the impact.
Exactly.
So the counterfactual, if it were struck, it would break, is false.
Right.
but the vase is still fragile.
Yeah.
So again, the simple conditional analysis seems to give us the wrong answer.
Yeah, it's getting things wrong again.
Okay. And then there's one more type of counterexample called mimickers.
Right.
So tell me about mimickers.
So mimickers are kind of the opposite of maskers.
Okay.
So in this case, you have something that looks like it has a disposition, but it doesn't really.
Okay.
And this is because something else is causing the manifestation.
Okay.
So the classic example here is a styrofoam dish.
Okay.
So styrofoam dishes are not fragile.
Right. They're designed to be kind of flimsy and bendy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now imagine there's this person who really hates styrofoam.
Okay.
And let's call them the hater of styrofoam.
The hater is styrofoam.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this person, whenever they hear the sound of a styrofoam dish being struck, they rush over and smash it.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So if the styrofoam dish were struck, it would break.
Right, because the hater's styrofoam would break it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not because the styrofoam dish itself is fragile.
Right.
It's because of this external agent.
So again, this is a problem for the simple conditional analysis.
Right, because it says if it would break, if struck, then it's fragile.
Right.
But in this case, that's not true.
Right.
It's only breaking because of the hater of styrofoam.
Okay, so the simple conditional analysis seems to be in a bit of trouble here.
Yeah, it's facing some serious challenges.
It's got finks and maskers and mimickers all coming after it.
It's under attack from all sides.
Yeah.
But, philosophers are clever.
Of course.
They don't give up easily.
Right. So are there ways to defend this simple conditional analysis?
Yeah, there are some philosophers who have tried to rescue it.
Okay.
And one way to do that is to be more careful about how we specify the disposition.
Okay.
So, for example, Choi and Gunderson, they argue that when we say something is fragile, we don't mean that it would break if struck in absolutely any circumstances.
Right, like even with a fink or a masker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What we really mean is that it would break if struck under certain normal conditions.
Right, like in the absence of finks or maskers.
Exactly.
So maybe we need to build that into our analysis.
Right. Maybe we need to say something like an object X is disposed to manifest M when subjected to stimulus C, if and only if it would manifest M if it were subjected to C and there are no finks or maskers or mimickers around.
Okay, so we're kind of adding a clause to our analysis.
Yeah, we're making it more specific.
Okay, so how does this help with the counterexamples?
Well, let's take the reverse cycle fink case. So the live wire won't conduct electricity if touched because the fink cuts the power.
Right.
But it would conduct electricity if touched in the absence of the fink.
Right, so it does have the disposition to conduct electricity.
Exactly.
It's just that the fink is messing things up.
Right, and the same thing goes for the masked glass vase.
Yeah.
It wouldn't break if struck while it's packed in styrofoam.
Right.
But it would break if struck if it weren't packed in styrofoam.
Right.
So it does have the disposition to be fragile.
Okay, so this defense is basically saying that we need to be more precise about the conditions under which the disposition would manifest.
Exactly. We need to rule out these weird cases where there are finks or maskers or mimickers interfering.
But are there any problems with this defense?
Well, some philosophers have argued that this strategy can lead to some pretty strange results. For example, Manley and Wasserman, they point out that if we keep adding more and more clauses to our analysis to rule out all the possible counterexamples, we end up with a really long and complicated definition of disposition.
Right.
And it might start to seem like we're just defining dispositions in a way that makes them immune to any counterexamples.
Right.
Which kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
And Hodgeck even proposes these things called minkish dispositions, which are kind of a variation on the fink idea.
Okay.
And he argues that even if we add all these clauses to our analysis, there are still cases where the simple conditional analysis gets things wrong.
Okay, so it's not a foolproof solution.
No, it's not perfect.
And there's another issue here that our source brings up, which is the intrinsicness of dispositions.
Right.
And we're going to talk about this in more detail later.
Right after that.
But the basic idea is that dispositions are supposed to be intrinsic properties of the object.
Right.
So they shouldn't depend on external factors, like whether there's a fink or a masker around. But if we have to keep adding these clauses to our analysis to rule out those external factors,
right,
it starts to look like dispositions are actually extrinsic.
Yeah, it kind of undermines the idea that they're intrinsic.
Right, so this defense of the simple conditional analysis might create other problems.
It might raise more questions than it answers.
Okay, so the simple conditional analysis is kind of on shaky ground.
Yeah, it's not looking so good.
But There are other analyses out there.
Oh yeah, there are plenty more.
Okay, so what are some of the more sophisticated analyses?
So one of the most famous ones is Lewis's revised conditional analysis, or RCA.
Right. Okay, so Lewis is trying to improve on the simple conditional analysis.
Exactly. He's trying to fix the problems that we've been talking about.
Okay, so what's his solution?
Well, his analysis is a bit more complicated, but here's the basic idea. He says that an object X is disposed to manifest M when subjected to stimulus C, if and only if X possesses an intrinsic property, B, such that if C were to occur, and if X were to retain B for a sufficient duration, then the occurrence of C and the continued presence of B would jointly cause X to manifest M.
Okay, wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tongue twister.
So can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. So the key additions here are the intrinsic property B and the requirement that X retains B throughout the stimulus period.
Okay, so B is like the causal basis of the disposition.
Exactly. It's the underlying property that makes the object disposed to manifest M when subjected to C.
Okay, and why is it important that X retains B?
Well, that's how Lewis deals with the Fink cases.
Okay, so let's go back to the reverse cycle Fink.
Okay.
Remember the wire that's live, but then the Fink cuts the power when it's touched.
Right.
So in this case, the wire does have an intrinsic property that makes it disposed to conduct electricity.
Right. Let's say it's a certain configuration of electrons. And let's call that property B.
Okay.
Now, according to Lewis's analysis, the wire is only disposed to conduct electricity if it retains B during the stimulus period, which is being touched.
Right.
But the reverse cycle Fink removes B at the very moment the wire is touched.
Right. It cuts the power.
Exactly.
So the wire doesn't retain B,
Right.
and therefore it's not disposed to conduct electricity in that situation.
Exactly. So Lewis's analysis gets the right answer in this case.
Okay, so it handles Finks.
It does.
But what about maskers and mimickers?
Oh, that's where things get a little trickier.
Okay,
So let's take the masked glass vase.
right, the one packed in styrofoam.
Yeah.
So if it were Streck, it would presumably retain its molecular structure,
Right.
which is the intrinsic property that makes it fragile.
We'll call that property B.
Okay,
So it retains B,
right,
but it doesn't break because the styrofoam is in the way.
right.
So in this case, B doesn't actually contribute to causing the breaking.
Right.
It's like its causal power is blocked. So Lewis's analysis seems to get things wrong here.
Okay, and what about mimickers?
So with mimickers, let's go back to the styrofoam dish and the hater of styrofoam.
Right,
So the styrofoam dish retains its intrinsic properties when it's struck.
right.
Let's say it's a certain molecular arrangement that makes that characteristic styrofoam sound when it's hit.
Okay,
Let's call that property B.
okay,
Now, B does contribute to causing the breaking.
right. Because it makes the sound that attracts the hater of styrofoam.
Exactly.
But it's not the kind of breaking that we associate with fragility.
Right. It's not the dish itself shattering.
Yeah, it's the hater of styrofoam doing the breaking.
Exactly.
So again, Lewis's analysis seems to get things wrong.
Yeah, it seems like it's overgenerating.
Right, it's counting things as fragile that aren't really fragile.
Exactly.
Okay, so Lewis has some work to do.
He does.
How does he try to fix these problems?
Well, he offers some additional strategies.
Okay,
For maskers, he suggests that we can either be more specific about the disposition. So instead of saying the glass is disposed to break if struck, we could say the glass is disposed to break if struck, and it's not packed in styrofoam.
okay, so we're kind of changing the stimulus condition.
Yeah, we're ruling out the masking condition.
Right.
Or we could say that the glass is disposed to break if struck, but that disposition is masked.
So we're acknowledging the masking, but saying that the disposition is still there.
Right.
Okay, and what about mimickers?
So for mimickers, he says that we should only count something as having a disposition if the manifestation occurs through a direct and standard causal process.